My name is Rafi Santo. I'm from the Make to Learn team at Indiana University. I just wanted to welcome folks to Family Learning and Maker Spaces. We have a great panel lined up. Janella Watson and David Kenter from the New York Hall of Science, and Adam Nye and Lisa Brahms from the Pittsburgh Children's Museum. So I'll let them take it away.
I'll do that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Janella Watson. I'm the Director of Early Childhood and Family Learning at the New York Hall of Science. I am a former Chicagoan who came from 8 years at the Cole Children's Museum of Greater Chicago as a museum educator and marketer, and then more recently ran a company in Glenview called Make a Masterpiece. It started as a pop-up marketing activation for Bounty paper towels, inspiring kids to explore and express their creativity by making big messes, and then in swoops Bounty to clean it all up. And happy to be sharing with you a little bit about the family making going on at the New York Hall of Science.
And my name is Adam Nye. I am the Make Shop manager. My background is in education policy, and my master's was looking at a comparison of playing and making.
Just go? Oh, there we go. My name is Dr. David Kenter. I am director of SciPlay at the New York Hall of Science, which is our research center for play science and technology learning.
And I'm Lisa Brahms, and I'm the Director of Learning and Research at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh, and that's a combination of research and what is essentially our education department. I'm also a member of the University of Pittsburgh Center for Learning in Out-of-School Environments, or UPCLOSE. So it's a research team out of the University of Pittsburgh. So we're excited to be here and share some emergent thinking we have around an IMLS grant that we got from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to study family participation in museum-based makerspaces. So as you know, we're from the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh and from NYSCI. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know as a field about family learning in museums, explain our research questions. We're going to share each of our contexts of participation a little bit more deeply. Talk about our principles of practice and design, share a couple stories from our spaces of family learning, and then explore some challenges and opportunities that this research presents. So, as you may know, in children's museums and science centers, families are the dominant audience. Families typically bring to their museum experiences a set of ways of thinking and working together, practice methods of cooperation and communication, systems of shared beliefs and values, really agendas and their own motivations and expectations for what they're going to find and do at the museum. And then they're composed of diverse ages and genders, which this is very different and important defining characteristics of a museum or a science center versus, say, a classroom context for learning or making. When they're learning in museums, families relate and reinforce shared experiences and family history. They negotiate a lot between the child's interest and the parent's interest, as well as their knowledge and choices they make. The ways in which they learn are differentiated across the family system. And the learning is often opportunistic. It's not about first we do this and then we do this. There's an opportunity to experience something together right now, and it's often mediated by what's around them. They are designed as learning environments, and so we design for that type of learning. So I just told you a little bit about what we know about museums. So, family audiences, leisure and learning, typical ways in which they experience things. And then makerspaces are kind of at odds with, and the ways in which makerspaces have been thought about traditionally are very much at odds with what we know about family learning. Making has been an adult, traditionally, of course, now we're moving into a new realm, but traditionally, making has been a kind of adult-oriented activity. really based in skills, processes, and products. Open-ended making with tools, equipment, and processes that may be kind of dangerous when you're thinking about children as members of families. And really, you need a certain kind of expertise in order to progress in making. So these things are at odds, and now that museums are really showing a great interest in making, maker spaces are popping up everywhere in museums, and so the research that we're allowed to do, that IMLS has enabled us to do, is really helping to fill an important void. And how do you really integrate making authentically into these family learning design contexts? So these are some of the research questions that we are tackling. How should we design to best support the range of family participation in museum-based makerspaces? That is our number one question. To support those questions, we're looking at the ways in which families do participate. We're looking at what is evidence of learning as they participate. And then how are the ways in which this is happening, how is this changing the way museums are thought about as learning environments? So I'm going to pass the mic over to Adam to tell you a little bit about MakeShop as a learning context.
Thank you. So MakeShop is, it opened in October 2011. It's an 1,800 square foot exhibit space that I have the pleasure of managing. MakeShop is a partnership of the Children's Museum, the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon, which is a game design master's program, and as Lisa mentioned, also the Center for Learning in Out-of-School Environments at the University of Pittsburgh. So MakeShop is really coming from the museum's interest in playing with real stuff. It's something that the museum kind of committed itself to when it went through an expansion in 2004, and so we've had this history of providing real tools and materials and processes to children, and so we designed a space that is really just a fully equipped workshop for children and families that has those real tools and materials. And we designed it using the museum's design principles, which, as you can see up here, kind of guided the design and development of MakeShop. I already talked about the design philosophy, but also just touching on a few other points. It's a very flexible space. Nothing is permanent except the sink and the doors, and so it can change, and often does change very quickly, and which allows for catering to specific interests and different activities and groups. It's also tough enough, which is kind of something that the museum prides itself on, having a very tough and durable exhibit space that can withstand the abuse of many children all of the time. And prototyping, the design process and prototyping is something that we not only want our visitors to do, but something that we practice through exhibit design and every project that we do or put on the floor. So when we first opened, we thought that this would be the guiding question: what do you want to make? And we quickly realized that that was a difficult question for a lot of children to answer. And that's, they don't have experience making, and they don't have experience with the tools and processes that we're asking them to use to make something. And so we got a lot of blank stares. And so through some thinking about it, we kind of expanded those entry points and different ways of trying to engage children who don't have experience making. So these are some sketches. Some children do still come into the space and they have an idea and they can pursue it and they are fully prepared to pursue it. But other children just simply need to explore with stuff, tools and materials, touching things, understanding how things work and why one tool is better than another. Also processes, not really having a specific end goal in mind, just hammering a nail is something that could be really fulfilling for any child who doesn't have experience doing that otherwise. And so facilitation is something that's really important in this space. It's a very well-staffed area. I have 5 full-time teaching artists who are practitioners in many different areas. And they work pretty much one-on-one with children, trying to guide their making experience to understand different tools and materials and to actually achieve making something. Is there a slide about the different things that we do? Okay, so I'll briefly talk about my facilitation, the different things that we do. So we ask questions. Children, they have tons of questions about this stuff, but instead of answering those questions with just simple knowledge, we try to engage them in this question conversation to get them to think about the potential answers for a problem or a question. And that not only helps them to think more deeply about the experience, but it's also very special for the facilitators to think deeply about different ways of looking at things and different ways of understanding stuff. We also encourage children to think very innovatively by supporting their ideas. Children come in and they have very big ideas and big goals, and I think Lisa will talk about one example that's really awesome. But instead of saying, no, you can't make something that's very extravagant or difficult, we try to engage them in a decision-making process so that they can guide themselves to a very achievable goal or object that they want to make. We also notice connections, meanings, and functions because children can connect and learn something if they can connect it to something that they're already familiar with. So something as simple as, hey, have you ever seen anything made with wood, or what do you think you could use sewing to make? It's something that can connect back to something that they're already familiar with. Switches is a really good example. Have you ever seen a light switch before? What do you think it does? And then it just helps them to guide their learning. And then we also position adults and children as co-learners and collaborators. So we encourage children to be the facilitators of experiences for adults, and also to encourage adults to be learners with their children. And it's important for us to position both children and adults as co-facilitators with the facilitators of MakeShop because, one, it's helpful for staffing, but also because it becomes a shared experience between the entire family unit. So when we originally opened the space, we intended the space to be for 8 to 12-year-olds. But we quickly realized that it's a children's museum, and we're really interested in the entire family unit. So scaffolding is something that we constantly think about, and we're very committed to scaffolding making experiences for very young children. And so this slide is an example of how we scaffold sewing. So you might start at one of the top and bottom corner slides, where you're touching thread, a needle, and you're just going through this pegboard, this recycled pegboard, to understand the motion of sewing. And then you might progress to actually sewing something, and then get all the way to a sewing machine, maybe add in e-textiles. But just introducing the most basic processes, tools, and materials, and realizing that those are super complex for very young children, and very fulfilling for them. Just holding a hammer and understanding how it's used is something that's really important for them. And so MakeShop is not only an exhibit space in the Children's Museum, but there's also a lot of other stuff happening around it. The first is the blog, which is a very wonderful kind of reflection of everything that we do in MakeShop. It's personal stories, pictures, a ton of videos. It's really fun to look through. Every semester, we are fortunate enough to have a group of graduate students from the ETC who help us to integrate digital media into the space. Last semester, 2 semesters ago, they developed a programming block system to introduce computer programming to young children. This semester, they're creating an interface for young children to use a laser cutter. So really exciting stuff. We're also working with a lot of schools, helping teachers to think differently about approaching making experiences in their context, which is informing the next version of MakeShop, which will be a version of MakeShop that goes into schools, communities, and library centers and tries to create a sustainable making experience and environment in different contexts. MakeShop Toolkit is something that we just launched and are still kind of launching. But it's an online resource for other museums and places to create a makerspace in their own place. And part of that is a portfolio system where children can capture what they made, but then tag it with processes, tools, and materials that they use to make it. So again, shifting the focus from that end product to the steps that they use to make something. We have adult make nights, which are really fun, doing the same thing that we do with kids, but with adults, and they love it. MakerCore and the Maker Education Initiative, we're fortunate enough to have Lisa's in the crowd if you want to talk to her. And then playtesting is something that we're hoping to become a place where outside companies can playtest their products with our audience.
The New York Hall of Science is really invested in the ideas of design, make, and play, and it manifests itself in really 100 different ways throughout the museum, from our participation in the World Maker Faire to our pending creation of a new permanent exhibit space called Design Lab. The museum is really exploring the ideas of what it means to design and make and encouraging families to play together in meaningful ways. One of those manifestations is our makerspace. So the Cognizant Makerspace was developed originally as a hub for educational making programming. Really, it's a box in which we can introduce a whole host of making programs for different audiences. There are school making opportunities, programs for teens, and then there are certainly rich opportunities for families to design together. It really is a shell that is a host to all of the materials, tools, and potential for processes that are needed to support making, but I think an important emphasis here is on the everyday nature of those tools. It's the sanding blocks and the workbenches, along with the digital tools like Scratch and digital making stations that really make the space come alive for families. They can see things that they recognize in the space, and even the youngest makers among us have an opportunity to recognize things and then explore materials and everyday tools in new and fantastic ways. Our space is host to the Make Academy and Maker Weekends, which are really open-ended opportunities for families to come in and tinker, design, and make together. They are not pinned down by an age range, but really do focus on materials exposure and what we call materials literacy, messing around, tinkering with different objects and items and combining them in different ways to some fantastic outcomes. And our signature program for early learning is Little Makers. As the director of early childhood education and family learning, I really saw the potential in our makerspace to not only invite the teens and the middle schoolers into the world of designing and making, but really saw it as an opportunity to invite whole families to the making experience and impart the most meaningful parts of making in terms of foundational skills being built. Little Makers invites families with young children as young as 18 months up through their older siblings at 12 and 13 years old to come tinker, design, and make together. The goals of this program are to scaffold that materials literacy and get kids hands-on, or what I like to say, hands-in, to the making process, to provide that early introduction to tools and tool making, to inspire collaboration, as Adam was mentioning, of parents and children and older siblings as co-learners and equal participants, and really activate parents as first science teachers, to empower them with really reticent knowledge about science and making that they can bring to the fore and explore with their children in new and meaningful ways. In doing so, we hope that we can really elaborate on what families already do together. Recognize that bath time and cooking together in the kitchen are important foundational parts of the making process, and also encourage that hands-on learning and continued participation outside of the museum context. We want families to feel free to take the skills and the processes that they learn in our Little Makers workshops and bring those back home in meaningful ways that continues the learning and then prepares young children to start school with active, really great curiosity about the world around them, and meaningful participation with their classmates in terms of already having experienced those co-learning opportunities. I'll get to talk a little bit more about the Little Makers in our story process, but I'd like to reintroduce Lisa, and she'll talk a little bit about the design principles behind Make Shop.
So, well, just this is what Make Shop looks like, so it's pretty exciting to see. Yeah, so in addition to the design principles that Adam talked about as far as what the museum thinks about generally when designing exhibits, we've really come to understand Make Shop as having some unique and important guiding ideas as well. Thinking about the museum as a context where these things like tools and materials are abundant, accessible, and visible. The interest-driven learning where people can organize around things they're interested in. As Adam said, we have a staff of all really expert makers in different areas, and that has proven to be essential and really exciting in the ways that it drives what's possible in the space. Flexibility, just to reiterate how important that is in our space. You come in one day and you come in about 3 hours later and the space will look different. It changes both physically, but then also flexibility of thought is very important, both for our visitors and for our staff. Adam spoke about these expert-novice relationships. And then, again, with this whole ideas, stuff, and processes, that there's an exploratory, process-based, and product-driven orientations are all possible in this space. And then, of course, we want it to be a safe environment that encourages people to try again. So those are some important aspects of Make Shop that we've come to understand.
At NYSCI, as we dive into this work of the IMLS grant, we've really challenged ourselves internally to define what we mean by design and making. And what we found is, while each of our programs across the institution really had different goals and outcomes to some degree, there were some tenets that were shared across the board that we started to recognize as kind of core to what may eventually evolve into a central theme or context for our making and design programs. From problem solving and iteration to collaboration, and the list goes on, we recognized that really each of these tenets was visible in some respect in each of the programs, but that each of us came to focus on or concentrate on a select few of them in terms of what was really salient for our audience, and also what we were hoping the outcomes of the experience would be. With our very youngest learners, for instance, my focus certainly has been on the materials literacy component and the tool use, and also that collaborative learning experience. But it doesn't mean that it's not embedded with the idea of learning basic science process skills, the observation and the measurement, and that come along with basic science learning. And each of these is represented in each of our programs to a different degree, making, I think, a really rich fabric for making in a lot of different contexts within the same institution. And now we'll share a little bit about really the narratives that are woven into what we do in our Make Shop and in the makerspace.
Really quick, I don't want to be negligent to recognize that although we are the two central research contexts, we have other thought partners in this process as well. The Maker Education Initiative and Make Magazine, as well as the Exploratorium. Together we share some really rich conversations around these ideas, and so they lend really important and insight into the conversation. So I want to share, we each want to share some stories of family learning in Make Shop, and I'm going to tell you one story about a friend of mine named Max. He is 4 years old, and when Max first came to Make Shop, it was really when we first opened the space. So when we greeted Max, Jeremy, who was the teaching artist who greeted him, greeted him and said, "Hello, my name is Jeremy. What do you want to make today?" And Max looked at him blankly, as Adam said, and kind of scared, I think, because this exhibit space used to be Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, which looked a lot different. And then Jeremy said, "Okay, well, what do you like to do, Max? Do you like to hang out inside or outside? Who do you like to play with?" And Max's response was, he looked around and he said, "My grandpa has a lawnmower." And so from there, Jeremy said, "Well, do you want to make a lawnmower today?" And so together, the two of them spent about 2.5 hours making a lawnmower out of wood. Max's mom was present during the entire process. This was a pretend lawnmower. It was a Max-size lawnmower. Then a few weeks later, actually 2 weeks later, Max came in and he ran right up to Jeremy. And he said, "Jeremy, I know what I want to make today." And Jeremy said, "What do you want to make, Max?" And he goes, "I want to make a wet dry vac." Yep. So together they again made a wet dry vac. The next time Max came in, he actually brought a sketch of the thing he wanted to make, and that was a jackhammer. So together they again made a jackhammer. I think actually this was with a different teaching artist, and as Max and his mother would come back every time. They became more integrated into the space, felt more comfortable there with the people in the space. The subsequent opportunities, I should show you some pictures of Max making these things. He next came in and made a snowblower. And then the next time Max came in, he said that he really wanted to make a weed whacker. And so the weed whacker that Max made, while we were making, he was working with Rebecca, and this was over the course of months, and we all got to know Max. When Max came in, everybody got very excited, me especially, and the opportunity for adding complexity to Max's making was just there. And so when they were making the weed whacker, Rebecca was like, you want to actually make your weed whacker work? And so together we went over to the electronic circuit blocks and we talked about electricity and how it works and how you connect a circuit and how you add a switch. And so Max really, made his weed whacker, his pretend weed whacker, work. And then the last time Max, not the last time, but the last time in this story, that Max came in, the workshop space was actually closed for a school group. And so we had to coax Max. He got very upset. He had this idea of a thing that he wanted to make, and the workshop space is where we do things like woodworking and soldering. Out in the other more flexible space, we have the sewing machine and opportunities for things like hand sewing. And so together, through a lot of talking, his mom was involved in this talking, thinking about things that Max was interested in home, the things that he needed to complete his set of tools. Together we thought, why not make a tool belt? And so together we sewed Max a tool belt, and Max sewed himself a tool belt, really. And so in the end, I was asking Max about his making, and he said, I'm making my own set of tools so that my grandpa and I can work together. And one of the really wonderful things about this is not only did Max develop a relationship with Make Shop and with our staff, but this was an ongoing relationship that he was developing with his grandfather that happened somewhere else. Both, the concept and the grandfather was present in the museum in Max's mind, but then also, what was possible once Max went home is pretty remarkable, and then also the role that his mother played in being able to calm Max down when things didn't go the way he wanted. He still is a 4-year-old and has tantrums every once in a while. The ways that she could relate family experiences. So this is a pretty remarkable story, but it isn't unique. We have many families that we have grown to love. And so that's just one example of family learning in Make Shop. And now Janella will tell you a little bit more about some opportunities in Little Makers.
A little bit unlike Make Shop, our Little Makers program is thematic. So each week, families are invited to come and explore a specific kind of making. And while the opportunities and the options and the decisions are really endless in terms of where a child takes it, we're really introducing some base materials and processes that they can then build from. So starting with our Weaving Works activity, it really was a rich opportunity to see the weaving of novice and expert. Our families came into the makerspace, and really none of them had extensive experience in weaving, the parents nor the children. We started with large-scale weaving on a very large metal guardrail. You may be familiar if you've done any museum admission corralling, where children could do large-scale weaving to practice the motor skills necessary to weave. We then invited families to make their own looms out of hoops and hula hoops on a little bit larger scale. And this really presented greater challenge for both parents and child than we could have ever anticipated. Our facilitators really had gotten more experience in terms of creating their own looms and getting it started. And it really was a beautiful and delicate balance between empowering the parents and the children to create together and using that expertise that our facilitators had grown into in terms of how to start their loom. The idea of really wanting to start with an odd number of spokes in order to make their looms work. And then the children and parents dived in together to the process of choosing beautiful bits of fabric and ribbon. I think that this experience in itself really was one that demonstrated to me the persistence that can come through the making process. Even through the challenge and the frustration that they felt at starting their looms together, we saw about 20 families sitting on rugs and on stools around the makerspace for 2 hours and weaving together. That kind of deep engagement and the really the desire to carry through and make sure that the skills were acquired in a meaningful way that they could then carry on to other experiences in terms of the next activities that would come in the makerspace was really evident in this work. You can see the delicate work that a mother and daughter are engaged in together here. And then the products that the children came up with in the end were really evident of a deep level of satisfaction in having learned the skills and mastered the skills that they were attempting. In the lower corner there, what you may be able to make out is a spider that developed from the weaving process, and just above it, the makings of a hat that really came out to a full-fleshed hat when she was done. My favorite Little Makers experience thus far has been ice cream making, and really it's taking the science of the everyday. Really, parents and children equally love ice cream, and breaking it down into an encouragement of exploring what is behind our everyday experiences. So we started with a water table filled with blocks of ice and salt. We encouraged the kids and parents to shake the salt onto the ice and then drip liquid watercolor to explore what happens to the ice as it interacts with the salt. This gets the thought process going that something not just magical happens when you combine ice and salt, but that there's science behind every piece of what we see and explore in the world around us. The next step is really creating a sensory opportunity for the kids. So we set up a smelling station where they could have exposure to all of the ingredients that they might possibly want to add to their ice cream. This was cocoa powder and mint, cinnamon and cardamom, and really exposing children to the smells of the ingredients that we sometimes underestimate having power in terms of rich sensory experience, and then making their own recipe card or their plan for what they wanted to create. We then had them put all of their ingredients with milk and sugar into a Ziploc baggie, and then the shaking begins. You put that Ziploc baggie inside another larger bag with ice and salt and begin to shake. And it takes a solid 12 minutes of shaking to make it into ice cream. For our 2-year-olds, a pretty impossible task to ask of them, but it's really where some rich sharing of the experience came into play. It was passing that bag of ice cream from parent to child to older sibling and back again. Some of them making a game of hot potato or cold potato out of it. And in the end, the product that they were able to share together, sitting down with their spoons and tasting what they had created, was really a product of that shared experience. It was hard work that everyone had put in together, and thought and decisions in terms of what ingredients to combine, along with the combination of all of the science behind the combination of those ingredients and the process that richly really mixed together into this beautiful family experience that you can see in all of the taste testing going on there. Finally is a story about paper making. We had this father and son team come into Little Makers for the first time. The little boy is almost 4 years old. He entered the makerspace and saw the vat of paper pulp and immediately bolted from the makerspace, literally ran out. His father ran after him, followed by one of our facilitators. And no matter what the father said, it's gonna be fun, it's just paper and water. He recognized and told the staff member, I guess he really doesn't like to get his hands messy. Recognizing that there was an opportunity here to set up an experience for this child that could build his comfort level, the facilitator quickly went back into the makerspace and found completely clean tools and cleaned a workstation for this pair to start at. It really took both the father and the facilitator to coax the little boy back. You don't have to touch anything. You'll use new tools that you haven't seen before, and your hands won't touch a thing to get him back into the space. He really hesitantly, but eventually, stuck his hand in the paper pulp to scoop some out into his screen. As they were pressing bits of fabric and shiny material into their made paper, the little boy was less ginger. And as they were squeezing all of the water out of the pulp in the final steps of making their paper, he was enthusiastic. He said to his father, "Can we do this again?" And the father said, "Sure." Not only in the museum context, he said, "This is something we can do at home." The father shared, "This is something that I remember doing as a child." And really, it was a beautiful experience of seeing a father share not just his expertise and his skills with his son, but sharing that personal piece of experiences that he had in getting hands-on, getting hands in, and getting messy that became a very meaningful experience for them, and one that they've repeated in returning to Little Makers time and time again over the past few months. Each of our activities is equally messy, and sometimes the son has a tough time, but we also really are encouraged and inspired by the idea that this is often a beginning in terms of the making relationship between young children and their parents, and one that can, if it can be sustained, will continue, not just through the trajectory of all of the making experiences that NYSCI has to offer, but one that will continue for a lifetime together.
So these, we just wanted to sort of regroup about some of the salient features from these stories. What are some of the things that are true to both, and some of the things that really show important distinctions between our spaces? So, yeah.
First is a recognition of the roles and the responsibilities and resources that come into play in each of these contexts. There's a role for the facilitator, both in the Max story and in our paper-making story, and a role for the parent, not just as the expert in a process, but often as the learner, and certainly a role for the child, often leading the experience, deciding which direction to take their making experience next.
Yeah, and as resources, really thinking about the social and dispositional resources that are being developed in these stories as the roles shift and as family, parents know their children best, and the ways in which that relationship can really add to a sense of empowerment for a child and a sense of purpose for a parent. So next is really connecting learning across context, the ways in which both of these, all the stories you heard really, there's a translation of making across, like from the museum to the home, back to the museum, and vice versa. So it's, that I think is one of the more important things, again, relating back to what we know about families and the ways in which they bring their life as a family to the museum, and how important that is when thinking about designing for family making.
I think each of our making contexts, Make Shop and Makerspace, present a multitude of interesting points in terms of whether our goals are personal or group goals. In our Little Makers program, often the scope of what is created is much more narrow. They are thematic programs where everyone is making ice cream today. The choices embedded in that process are certainly varied, but everyone comes out at the end with ice cream. While in Make Shop, really the opportunities are very open-ended and often are personal in terms of the motivation and the driven by the self-interest of the family or the child himself in the making process.
And then, making as not just making a thing, but making as a mindset, making as a process. When thinking about families, how do you encourage families to want to fail and try again, to want to practice, to approach these sorts of experiences as playful learning experiences, as collaborative learning experiences, knowing that sewing two pieces of fabric together is as rewarding an outcome as creating an entire garment for a family or for a young child. So these are things that we're continually thinking about and talking about. You want me to take the authenticity one? So authenticity, we had a great conversation with our thought partners a few weeks ago, and this was just a term that maybe should be on the next slide as like a kind of challenge, then opportunity that we're really thinking about. But what does it mean to provide authentic making experiences for young children and families? Is a really important question. And is that through scaffolding? Is that through the use of real tools and materials? Is a young child's making any less authentic than a professional or an expert maker's? These are questions that we're playing with and that we both grapple with. And how that relates then to the disciplines of that comprise making, of the STEAM or STEM disciplines. So, David, did you want to add anything on that?
I have a follow-up question on this point, but why don't you go forward and
Okay.
then I'll ask my question.
All right. So, okay, so this is just moving forward. Again, this is through our conversation, some of the things that came up and some of the questions that we're pursuing as we move forward with this project. We're just beginning this research. It will take place over the course of a few more years, and we're excited to work together to think through all of these things. So, again, thinking about museums as contexts for family learning and making, and that there's a spectrum of experience, that an exhibit space is equally as interesting as a programmatic space or a more defined exhibit space. That all of these are really important ways in which making is possible in these design environments. One of the questions that came up in that conversation was, how do we support one another to take different steps? Which I thought was a really wonderful and needed question that we have to ask each other. And then, thinking about our own productive constraints in a museum, like sound and choice and comfort and our capacity. When making one-on-one, you can't serve 100 kids. So, the group dynamic, how these things factor into what it means to make in a museum. The design of the space, again, design environments. We were talking a lot about how an environment can convey a point of view. The messiness of making versus the pristineness of a museum. And then facilitation, many of the things that we're thinking about are scaffolding, these types of experiences, expert makers present, and then, expert makers versus explainers is something. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
In the Make Shop, you heard Adam describe that really their staff are full-time practitioners. They are experts in certain fields of making, while the New York Hall of Science, our facilitators are our explainers. They're high school and young college students who really are experienced in explaining the science content behind exhibits. We've recognized this as an opportunity for us to reframe what it means to be a facilitator of a making activity, taking the inquiry approach that is so predominant in science centers and using the bits and pieces that our staff know about how to employ really deep questioning and flipping it on its head and letting the visitor be the guide in terms of the making experience is one of those pieces that we're still really working on and trying to make work in our setting.
Yeah, and then finally, another really important theme of the conversations we've had are this idea of sort of entry points and beginnings, pathways and outcomes. And so what are those? And in this type of environment, we know that the outcomes need to be different than the way they've been thought about in the past as far as disciplinary learning. We know that the beginnings are diverse and need to be, and we're really interested in the pathways. So what happens during the learning process? What are the practices that are being enacted? What is that evidence of participation that is meaningful? How is intentionality evidenced? And how are we encouraging kids to solve their own problems? So that is all for as far as formal presentation. I think we have time for David to give a few remarks and maybe some questions. 1 minute.
Well, maybe I'll just add a little bit of framing, which is to clarify the group that the work here that Lisa is directing is to both find these processes of caregivers working with children and sort of name them and classify them, but ultimately to try to figure out what design features in these maker spaces lead to the more productive of those processes and which features might lead to less productive processes. So there is a component of this that will feed back into our making spaces where we will be doing our own design experiment in trying to change the design of our maker spaces in the coming couple years based on the first couple years of work. The question that I had was actually related to your last couple comments about facilitation, and I'm sort of making this, it's a little, I'm blowing it out of proportion a little bit on purpose, but I know that you have these differences in who you guys hire as facilitators, and so could you say something about the productive or not productive conversations that you think happen by virtue of making those decisions? So are there real ramifications in those decisions in the kind of family practices that you guys see in your spaces?
I'll think about that. Rafi, do we have time for questions in general or no?
We're over?
Over.
Okay.
Oh. All right, well, I think we have 10 more minutes.
We have 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay.
So
Can you sort of,
Well, it's really just a simple question, which is that there are many design elements in your spaces. This is one that I know differs in particular with your focus on practices between caregivers and kids. Do you think you could really point to differences in those practices based on this design decision about who facilitates? Or is that too simplistic a question that, that we could never see that based on that?
I think that one of the really interesting frames in creating the Little Makers program is the recognition for me that that facilitation of quality early childhood experiences often closely mirrors how you would want facilitation of your making and design experiences to go. There are already some embedded best practices in terms of how to support young children's learning that really translate very naturally to work with young children in the making context. In that way, I think that we've kind of, really it's about amplifying the tenets of the kind of facilitation that works best with young children and training our explainer team to incorporate those into the making process that I'm finding the most successful route to getting them prepared. But it certainly is a leap in terms of the framework that's already been created or the mindset that's created in terms of a very practiced way of interacting with museum visitors and having to kind of flip it on its head in terms of this new kind of interaction that we're introducing.
yeah, and ours is actually, I think, an opposite situation where we didn't look for educators when we were finding our teaching artists. We really looked for makers, and through experience, they have developed the ability to work very well with families, but each of them has gone through their own learning curve and have been very reflective about it, but the learning how to be an educator is where we've put the emphasis as opposed to learning how to facilitate making.
And
Yeah.
I guess I brought up this, and then I'll throw it open to the crowd, but I think I brought this up because you shared some stories with me in the past about parent practices or caregiver practices with children where parents encountering your space and things like sewing machines for small children
Yeah.
will say, my child can't do that.
Yeah.
And it is an interesting difference in that a maker who is an experienced fabric artist who feels very comfortable helping a 3-year-old work with a sewing machine may be a different kind of facilitator than an educator who might know everything about working with children in general, but may not be personally as comfortable with that making tool. So let's let that hang as just a comment, and then we can open it up to questions. There is a mic if people want to come up and ask questions of these guys.
Yes, please. There's a mic if you want to. You don't have
Yell.
to.
Maybe I can talk loudly.
Yeah.
I had a question about like authenticity, and I was wondering how much you emphasize function versus aesthetics, particularly in your example with Max. Like I can imagine building a lawnmower, you can make something that looks like a lawnmower, but focusing on how to make a rotating part or something that might cut grass is a very different type of focus. So I just wondered how you balance those.
Yeah, and I think, this authenticity question and discussion is one that I think is just beginning. When we had our conversation with our thought partners a few weeks ago, it dominated the conversation. The conversation was 2.5 hours long. So even coming to understand what we all mean about authentic, we all, I think, had different understandings of what that might mean. I think for us, it means using real tools and materials as the beginning place, that real stuff, and thinking about getting to your own the most productive place for you to go next, for that child or that family. And I don't want to speak for you, but just from our conversation, there were, thoughts about in a science center, maybe authentic science practice is more might be a way of approaching an authentic experience. And so those functional aspects or the engineering aspects are thought about more in more of the thought about in that authentic way. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
I think a piece of our conversation really rested on also the idea of import of what was being made. And when you talk about function versus aesthetic, recognizing too that there are questions about how, when we talk about making real things or using real materials and real tools, one of the hearts of the question is how important is the product that is being made, or what is in reframing, the whole notion of our design lab, for instance, is asking posing problems worth solving. And to what degree are we preparing young children to tackle very serious things that they see in the world versus asking them to make ice cream and kind of uncover the wonder of the world around them? I think that it's an important tension that we're still exploring as an institution, the kind of gravity that you have to approach the design and the making process with. And I think it often informs the kind of product that comes out in the end, if it's something representational of what we see in the world around us, or if it's something really functional to address a need or a concern in the wider world.
Yeah, so stay tuned. Yeah. Yes.
Challenges of dealing with families that have multiple age levels and maybe multiple children involved in the projects. Do you take that into consideration when you're thinking about the themes and the actual programs that you're going to do?
Yeah, I think each activity that we offer, we try to think of different entry points for different ages and also levels of expertise and experience. So the first example that comes to mind is woodworking. I mean, if a child wants to come in and participate in woodworking, oftentimes a very young child can't actually go through the entire process of making a finished, refined woodworking project. So what we've done instead is create kind of parallel activities. So simply completing a process such as sanding or hammering a nail into a log is really fulfilling for a very young child, and we put those experiences in the same woodworking environment, so they're still a part of that environment, they're still in the same room with their family, and they're participating in a very meaningful activity for them that is still very much a woodworking process, but without that end goal in mind. So we were just shifting the focus from actually making a product to just holding a hammer or a tool or material and just completing a process.
Same tools or different tools?
Same tools, yeah.
In Little Makers, we're often asking a family to make a single product or go through a process together, no matter how many children are part of the family and how many children there are. So we often find that within a single project, there, as Adam was mentioning, there are different entry points and interests that drive who takes on what role within that experience. It also sets up what we like to think of as older siblings as science helpers as well. It helps them frame their own science knowledge and impart it to their younger sibling, and really creates a dynamic where a family is sharing an experience as opposed to kind of a parallel making experience where each child is coming up with their own product. It does create some tension sometimes.
But Janelle, what's intentional in your design that supports the one thing happening as opposed to the parallel play?
Often it's a directive that comes from a facilitator. It's really providing the materials for a single product to be made, even if in multiple iterations. So in In exploring circuitry, for instance, it's one circuit block or the ingredients to make conductive Play-Doh that makes enough for a single batch of Play-Doh to be composed. So a little bit of it is really in the framing and setting up the environment. The other is in kind of the gentle scaffolding of those experiences that really the facilitators have to guide in a lot of ways. Sometimes it does manifest itself in that parallel making. I had an experience this weekend of a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old in Little Makers with their mother and father. And it became really a design contest between the father and the sons, in which the father was the most prolific maker of wax-resist paintings that I had ever seen, and was really making side by side with his children. And we certainly didn't squash that experience from happening, especially because there's really a unique experience embedded in whatever family comes to the table in the making experience, and we want to encourage the richest experience for that family, not one that fits the frame that we've already preconceived as the best way for them to learn together.
Yeah, now we
So
are
I
out
think
of
we're out of time. Let's call it to a close and ask you guys to follow up with Janelle and Lisa and Adam as during the conference, and thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.